A team of scientists pointed a satellite at the Egyptian desert, and it found a river that was not supposed to be there. Not a metaphor, not a theory, a physical river, 64 kilometers of it, buried under farmland and sand for over 4,000 years, running in a straight line past 31 pyramids. For 2 centuries, engineers, historians, and physicists have tried to answer one question. How do you move a 2.5-ton block of limestone 2.3 million times without a single wheel or a single piece of iron and stack it into a shape that lines up with true north to within a 1/15 of a degree? The honest answer used to be a shrug. Ramps, probably. Ropes, obviously. Tens of thousands of men, certainly. That answer was never wrong, but it was never complete. And in the last decade, it has been replaced by something far more specific. Not a guess dressed up as an explanation, but a set of physical mechanisms, tested in labs, confirmed by satellite radar, and pulled out of the ground with tool marks still on them. This is what the evidence actually says, and where it still runs out. Start with the material itself, because the scale of the problem is easy to say and hard to actually picture. The Great Pyramid of Khufu contains somewhere around 2.3 million blocks, most of them limestone quarried close to the site, with a smooth white outer casing of fine Tur limestone brought from across the Nile, and granite for the internal chambers hauled 900 kilometers downriver from Aswan. Some of those granite beams weighing between 25 and 80 tons. It rose to roughly 146 meters, a height no human structure would exceed for close to 4,000 years. It was built, according to the current archaeological consensus, in around 20 years, during the reign of Khufu in the 4th dynasty, close to 2560 BCE. Do the arithmetic on that, and you get a rate of construction that sounds less like ancient religious devotion and more like a modern logistics operation. Somewhere close to 12 blocks set in place every working hour for 2 decades without the schedule collapsing. That number alone rules out the popular image of a chaotic mass of slaves dragging stone through the sand. Nothing chaotic sustains that pace for 20 years. What sustained it was organization, and the physical evidence of that organization has been sitting in the ground the whole time, waiting for someone to read it correctly. The first piece of that evidence is not a monument, it is paperwork. In 2013, a French archaeological mission led by Pierre Tallet was excavating a set of man-made caves cut into a hillside on the Red Sea coast at a site called Wadi al-Jarf, originally built to store the dismantled hulls of boats. Buried near the entrance of one gallery, the team found a stack of papyrus fragments, and they turned out to be the oldest inscribed papyri ever discovered in Egypt. They are not religious texts, they are logbooks, kept by a middle-ranking official named Merer, who supervised a crew of around 40 men and reported to a superior. The papyri record, in plain administrative language, where the crew slept each night, what cargo they loaded, and how long each leg of the journey took. Over and over, the destination listed is Akhet Khufu, the horizon of Khufu, the name the Egyptians used for the Great Pyramid complex itself. The log dates to the 26th or 27th year of Khufu's reign, which lines up with the final phase of construction, when the fine white outer casing was being applied. And what it describes, in the driest possible terms, is Merer's crew sailing loaded boats of stone, tying up at a basin beside the pyramid, unloading, and casting off again the next morning. Each boat carried somewhere around 70 to 80 tons, roughly 30 blocks of casing stone, and the crew made 2 to 3 round trips every 10 days, which works out to something in the neighborhood of 200 blocks delivered by water each month from a single crew. For a long time, this created an obvious problem because there is no water at Giza today. The Nile now runs several kilometers to the east, across farmland and city blocks, and the nearest thing to a waterway near the pyramid plateau is irrigation canals. So either the single oldest eyewitness record of pyramid construction was wrong about the most basic fact of the operation, or the landscape had changed and the change had simply been forgotten. In May 2024, a study published in the journal Communications, Earth, and Environment, led by Eamon Ghonim of the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, answered that question directly. Ghonim grew up in Egypt and had long been struck by the fact that the majority of Egyptian pyramids sit clustered along one narrow, dry, inhospitable strip at the edge of the Western Desert, a location that made no obvious sense for a civilization otherwise built entirely around the Nile. Her team combined radar satellite imagery, which can see through dry surface sand, with multispectral imaging, elevation models, and ground-based surveys using ground-penetrating radar and electromagnetic tomography. 2 deep soil cores, drilled to a depth of about 25 meters, came back with sandy sediment consistent with an old riverbed. What they had located was a lost branch of the Nile, roughly 64 kilometers long, between 200 and 700 meters wide, and over 80 feet deep in places, running along the base of the Western Desert Plateau. They named it the Ahrimat branch, Arabic for pyramids, because 31 separate pyramids, built across nearly 1,000 years of Egyptian history, sit strung along its former course. Giza itself sits about a kilometer from where the bank once ran. What makes this finding more than a piece of interesting geology is a detail Ghonem's team confirmed about causeways, the long raised stone walkways that lead down from many pyramid complexes toward a structure called a valley temple. Egyptologists had long catalogued these as ceremonial processional routes for funerary rites. The satellite mapping showed that these causeways run perpendicular to the vanished river and terminate directly on its former bank, at the valley temples themselves. In other words, the valley temples functioned as harbors, and the causeways functioned as loading ramps from the water up to the construction site. The entire layout of a pyramid complex, viewed with the river restored to the map, resolves into a working waterfront. When the river shifted east and eventually silted up, likely driven by a major regional drought that began around 4,200 years ago, along with increased wind-blown sand, the harbor function disappeared, and only the ceremonial shell of causeway and temple remained for archaeologists to interpret centuries later, minus the water that explained them. Merer's logbook was not describing something impossible. That still leaves the harder question, which is not how the stone got to the site, but how it got up. A pyramid is not a flat delivery problem, it is a vertical one, and this is where the historical debate has been loudest for the longest time. The default explanation, repeated in textbooks for generations, is a ramp, most often imagined as a single long, straight incline running up one face of the pyramid. The problem with that model is one its own supporters have acknowledged for decades. A ramp built at a slope gentle enough for a hauling team to actually manage a loaded sledge, something around a 7% grade, would need to be well over 2 kilometers long to reach the summit of the Great Pyramid. No quarry gap, and no archaeological footprint consistent with a ramp anywhere near that size. Steeper ramps solve the volume problem, but historically ran into a different objection, that a hauling crew loses the mechanical leverage needed to drag a multi-ton sledge once the slope gets much beyond a gentle incline. That objection stopped being purely theoretical in 2018, when an Anglo-French archaeological mission working at Hatnub, an alabaster quarry in the eastern desert roughly 65 kilometers southeast of modern Minya, uncovered a haulage system unlike anything found at any other ancient Egyptian site. Co-directed by Roland Enmarch of the University of Liverpool and Yanis Gordon of the French Institute for Oriental Archaeology in Cairo, the team found a central ramp flanked on both sides by a pair of staircases, each one lined with rows of post holes cut into the rock. The mechanism this implies is straightforward once you see it. A stone block sat on a sledge on the central ramp. Ropes ran from the sledge up and around the wooden posts fixed into the staircases, and hauling crews stood on the steps above the load, pulling. Gordon's own assessment, given directly to reporters at the time, was that with this system, workers could haul heavy alabaster blocks up slopes of 20% or steeper, roughly 3 times the grade that conventional ramp models had assumed was the practical limit. The rope and post arrangement acts as a mechanical force multiplier, and the crews above the load are pulling with the assistance of their own body weight rather than fighting gravity head-on. Tool marks at the site, along with 2 inscriptions bearing Khufu's name, date the system to his reign, meaning that during the exact years the Great Pyramid was under construction, Egyptian engineers already had a working method for moving multi-ton stone up slopes 3 times steeper than the models that had shaped a century of pyramid reconstructions. That single discovery collapses the 2-kilometer ramp problem. A much shorter, much steeper ramp, assisted by a rope and post staircase system, fits within the footprint of the Giza Plateau, without requiring a second phantom monument that then vanished without evidence. There's a separate piece of physical evidence that addresses a different part of the hauling problem, not the angle of ascent, but the friction of the ground itself. And it comes from a tomb rather than a construction site. In the tomb of a provincial governor named Jehuti-Hotep at Deir el-Bersha in Middle Egypt, a wall painting shows a single enormous alabaster statue mounted on a wooden sledge, with 172 men hauling it forward in 4 long lines. It is the most complete surviving depiction of Egyptian heavy load transport, and every element of the scene is labeled. Standing at the front of the sledge, at the leading edge of the runners, is a man pouring water onto the sand directly ahead of the load. For more than a century, Egyptologists interpreted this figure as performing a purification ritual, a symbolic blessing of the ground, rather than anything with a practical function. In 2014, a physicist at the University of Amsterdam named Daniel Bond tested that assumption directly. His team built small-scale sledges and ran them across trays of sand at varying moisture levels, measuring the force required to move a given load. On dry sand, grains pile up in front of the sledge runner, and the load effectively pushes an ever-growing mound of sand ahead of itself the entire distance. Adding water in the right proportion, somewhere around 2 to 5% of the sand's weight depending on grain size, causes the sand grains to bridge together through capillary action, stiffening the surface so it behaves less like loose sand and more like a compacted road. Bond's measurements showed the pulling force required dropped by roughly half. The results were published in Physical Review Letters, one of the most rigorous peer-reviewed physics journals in the world, under the title Sliding Friction on Wet and Dry Sand. The man in the painting was not performing a religious gesture. Vertical lift and horizontal friction both now have tested, published, physical explanations. The most contested and most recent piece of the puzzle goes a step further and applies specifically to the very first pyramid ever built. Not the Great Pyramid of Khufu, but the Step Pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, constructed around 2680 BCE under the architect Imhotep, roughly 60 to 62 meters tall, and the first monumental building in history made entirely of dressed stone. Scattered around Djoser's complex are several massive structures that have never had a fully satisfying explanation. The largest, called Gisr el-Mudir, is a colossal rectangular stone enclosure covering an area comparable to several football pitches, historically described in the literature with vague labels like cattle enclosure or unfinished fortification, none of which accounted for the scale of effort involved in building it. Nearby, a deep trench known as the Dry Moat encircles the pyramid complex, and its southern section contains a line of successive deep, compartmentalized chambers cut directly into the rock, similarly unexplained. In August 2024, a study published in the journal PLOS One, led by Xavier Landreau of the CEA Paléotechnique Institute in France, working alongside hydrologists and engineers from INRAE and the University of Orléans, mapped the historical watershed around Saqqara using satellite radar combined with archival survey records, and proposed that these separate structures are actually components of a single integrated system. To the west of Saqqara runs a dry channel called the Abusir Wadi, which historically carried seasonal runoff down from higher ground. The satellite mapping shows that Gisr el-Mudir does not sit beside that channel. It sits directly across it, intersecting the watercourse. Landreau's team interprets this not as an enclosure at all, but as a check dam, a structure engineered to slow floodwater, hold it back, and trap heavy sediment and debris during flash floods, exactly the kind of structure a modern hydraulic engineer would recognize on site. The team's proposal is that the compartmentalized chambers in the dry moat's southern section functioned as a sequential water treatment system, with water passing from one basin to the next, dropping sediment and turbidity at each stage, arriving progressively cleaner. And inside the step pyramid itself are two vertical shafts that have never had a convincing functional explanation. The paper proposes that clarified water may have been channeled into those shafts, where a wooden platform floating on the rising water level could lift a dressed stone block from the base of the shaft to the working height, with the platform returning as the water level dropped, a process the authors describe operating in a manner comparable to a modern hydraulic lift, powered by nothing more than the weight of water itself, with no pulleys, no complex moving machinery, and nothing to wear out beyond the platform. It is important to be precise about how the researchers themselves frame this idea, because the claim is genuinely still under debate within the field, not a settled finding. The paper describes it explicitly as a possible use of hydraulic force, and the authors state plainly that further work is needed to establish how much water the seasonal watershed could realistically have supplied, and how it would have moved through the shaft system in practice. A substantial number of Egyptologists remain unconvinced, and argue the shafts more likely served a funerary or symbolic purpose consistent with other elements of Old Kingdom pyramid design, a view with its own long academic history. What is not in dispute is that Gisr el-Mudir sits directly across a natural watercourse in a way consistent with dam engineering, and that the compartments in the southern moat correspond structurally to the stages of a sediment clarification system. Those two structures had no coherent functional explanation before this study, and now they have one that connects them to each other, even if the final step, connecting that system to the lifting of stone blocks, remains an open and actively argued hypothesis, rather than an established fact. None of this, taken together, points towards secret or lost technology, and it is worth being direct about that, because the mechanisms being described are not exotic. They are the ordinary output of a highly organized Bronze Age state applying careful observation, basic hydraulics, and iterative engineering refinement to an enormous logistical problem. The evidence for that organization runs well beyond the physical structures. South of the Sphinx, at a site called Hayt El Garab, excavations directed by the archaeologist Mark Lenner uncovered a planned settlement built specifically to house the pyramid workforce, laid out in long galleries where crews appear to have slept in organized rotations, alongside bakeries built around large bell-shaped bread pots and quantities of animal bone, indicating a sustained supply chain bringing in cattle. Sheep and goats from estates across the country to feed a large workforce on an ongoing basis. Inside the pyramid itself, in spaces above the king's chamber that were never meant to be seen again once construction finished, workers painted the names of their own labor gangs, including one that identified itself as the Friends of Khufu, evidence of organized rotating teams with their own identities, rather than an undifferentiated mass of forced labor. Skeletal remains recovered from the adjacent workers' cemetery show healed bone fractures, breaks that were properly set and allowed to mend correctly, indicating that someone with genuine medical knowledge was attending to injured laborers on site. Egyptian scribes also had the mathematics necessary for the geometry involved. A surviving papyrus of arithmetic problems shows a scribe calculating pyramid slope using a unit called the seked, expressed as palms of horizontal displacement per cubit of vertical rise, a written formula for pyramid geometry rather than a matter of guesswork. The surveying involved is, if anything, the most quietly impressive piece of the whole operation. The base of the Great Pyramid is aligned to true north with an error of less than 4 minutes of arc, roughly 1/15 of 1 degree. Khafre's pyramid is off by about 6 minutes, and Sneferu's Red Pyramid at Dashur by roughly 8.7 minutes, and all three share the same small counterclockwise rotational error, an error that shrinks over time as later builders refine their method. The engineer and archaeologist Glenn Dash proposed and tested an explanation for this pattern in 2016. On the day of the autumn equinox, the tip of a vertical rod's shadow traces a line that runs almost exactly east to west, a natural, repeatable method of establishing true north, using nothing more than a stick, a length of string, and the correct day of the year. Dash set up a rod, tracked the shadow's path, and found the resulting line carried a small counterclockwise deviation, matching the same magnitude and direction found in the pyramids themselves. The most precisely oriented monuments of the ancient world were very likely oriented using a method this simple, applied with extraordinary discipline and repeated correction over generations. It's also worth being honest that this engineering knowledge did not arrive fully formed. The generation immediately before Khufu shows the trial and error behind it in the clearest way possible, written directly into the stone. Khufu's father, Sneferu, built at least 3 pyramids in his own reign, and the middle one, at Dashur, is the physical record of a mistake being corrected in real time. It started at a steep angle of around 54 degrees, and partway up, the builders visibly changed the slope to a shallower 43 degrees, producing the structure now known as the bent pyramid, almost certainly because the steeper angle was placing more stress on the internal structure than the foundation and core could safely support, a risk the builders seem to have recognized before it became a collapse. Sneferu's next attempt, the Red Pyramid, was built from the start at that safer, shallower angle, and it stands today as the first true smooth-sided pyramid ever successfully completed. Khufu inherited a design that had already failed once, been corrected once, and succeeded once, and the Great Pyramid was built on the back of that accumulated documented experience rather than emerging from nothing. This matters because it undercuts the idea of a single flash of inspired genius. What the evidence actually shows is closer to an engineering program refined across 3 generations of a single family, with each pyramid functioning as a full-scale structural test for the next one. The tools behind all of this were, by later standards, strikingly simple, which is part of why the achievement is so often underestimated. Egyptian quarry workers cut limestone using copper chisels and saws, materials far softer than the bronze and iron tools that would follow centuries later, supplemented by dolerite hammerstones for the harder granite at Aswan, where teams pounded out channels around a block by sheer repetition before levering it free. Wooden sledges, rollers, levers, and plumb lines made from a weighted cord did the rest. There is no evidence of the wheel being used in construction, no pulley systems capable of lifting multi-ton loads, and no draft animals suited to hauling stone sledges over sand. Every mechanical advantage in this story, the wetted sand, the rope and post staircase, the possible hydraulic lift, exists specifically because the Egyptians could not brute force the problem with better tools. They solved it instead with a precise understanding of friction, leverage, and water, which is arguably a harder and more impressive kind of engineering than simply building a bigger machine. Put the full picture together, and what emerges is not a mystery about missing knowledge, but a fairly complete outline of a working system, a river highway that has since vanished beneath farmland, a wetting technique that cuts sledge friction roughly in half, a rope and post haulage system capable of climbing slopes 3 times steeper than earlier models assumed possible, a contested but increasingly serious hydraulic hypothesis for how the very first pyramid may have lifted stone through its own interior, a fed and medically cared for workforce organized into named rotating labor gangs, a written mathematics of slope, and a naked-eye astronomical method precise enough to align a building the size of a mountain to within a fraction of a degree. That is not one clever trick. It is a supply chain, a workforce management system, a survey discipline, and a set of mechanical solutions all running simultaneously and continuously for 2 decades. Measured against that, it stands as one of the earliest large-scale coordinated construction projects in the historical record, executed with resources and instruments that, on paper, look almost primitive and yet produced a level of precision that modern construction crews with laser levels and hydraulic cranes would still respect. There's one more thread the evidence has not closed, and it involves the Great Pyramid itself rather than Djosers. Since 2015, a research collaboration called Scan Pyramids has been imaging the interior of the Great Pyramid using muon tomography, a completely non-invasive technique that measures the density of solid stone by tracking cosmic ray particles called muons as they pass through it, with denser material absorbing more of them and empty space absorbing fewer. In 2017, using 3 independently built detector systems from research teams in Japan and France, the project identified a previously unknown cavity above the Grand Gallery, at least 30 meters long, the first major internal feature found inside the Great Pyramid in more than a century. In 2023, a follow-up study published in Nature Communications identified a second sealed corridor, roughly 9 meters long, hidden directly behind a set of chevron-shaped limestone blocks on the pyramid's north face, later confirmed independently by ground-penetrating radar and physically photographed using an endoscope threaded through a gap between the stones. Most Egyptologists do not believe either space contains hidden treasure. The leading interpretation is that both are structural, relieving spaces built to redistribute weight, or possibly the leftover internal architecture of the construction process itself, a theory that gained support from a 1986 microgravimetry survey that detected a spiral-shaped density anomaly winding upward through the pyramid's mass, and a pattern some researchers have connected to a proposed internal construction ramp. Neither space has ever been physically entered, and current Egyptian authorities have not authorized drilling into either one. Whatever they were built for, the answer is sitting inside a structure that has already been mapped down to the meter, sealed behind stone that has not moved in 4,500 years, waiting on a decision rather than a discovery. That's where the current science actually leaves this question, not with legend and not with certainty either, but with a set of real, testable, and in some cases still debated mechanisms that finally explain how a Bronze Age state, without iron tools, or the wheel built the most precisely engineered structure of the ancient world. If you want the next investigation the moment it's ready, the kind built on primary sources instead of recycled documentary claims, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because the sealed spaces inside that pyramid are still waiting for their answer, and when it comes, you'll want to be watching when it does.